Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. I am back with another court transcript from Diddy's trial. So Cassie was back on the stand for the third day, but this time it was for cross-examination by Diddy's defense team. She's holding up really well, but I've got to say, his lawyers are doing a strong job using her own words to raise doubts about whether she was actually forced to do those freak-offs. Just a heads up, this video is strictly the transcript, word for word of what was asked and answered. It's basically the full Q&A from the cross-examination. I'll be putting out a summary of each day soon. There's just a lot to go through. It's coming though, so stay tuned. Now I'm going to read the transcript. Before the cross-examination, Cassie's lawyer, Douglas Wigdor, says, I have a right to be part of the meet and the conference about which evidence she can be questioned about. She is the only victim witness that has standing under Rule 412. Then the judge says, we have to move forward. The judge says, other issues, Ms. Slavic? Then Ms. Slavic, the prosecutor, says, as we noted in our email to the court early this morning. Side note, the judicial documents are not being put in the public docket. The judge says we might get a sign from Ms. Estavajo, who will be cross-examining Cassie, that it's not an issue. Slavic says the defense last night dumped 400 exhibits on us. This cannot continue throughout the course of the trial. The judge says, Ms. Estavajo? Ms. Estavajo says we have been working tirelessly in response to Ms. Ventura's testimony. The judge says, Mr. Agnifilo, I thought you were going to take his off my plate. Agnifilo says, I will keep trying. This is the main witness. She stands by herself. That said, we have been doing this all night until 3 in the morning. We flag exhibits for them. Slavic says there are 24 exhibits that government has objections to. They are listed in the chart. The judge says, just the ones in the chart? Again, these judicial documents are not going into the public docket. Not the case in many other SDNY trials. The judge says, bring the jury in. Jury enters. Diddy's lawyer, Estavajo, says, Ms. Ventura, you love Mr. Combs, correct? Cassie says, I did. Estavajo says, for 11 years, you took care of him? Cassie says, in some ways. Estavajo says, you call him larger than life? Cassie says, I did. Estavajo says, others called him Diddy or Puff Daddy, but you call him Sean, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you knew a version of him the rest of the world couldn't see, right? Then the prosecutor says, objection. Then the judge says, overrule. Cassie says, in ways. Estavajo says, you kept coming back to him for 11 years. Cassie says, I wouldn't say coming back. Estavajo says, you believe he loved you too? Cassie says, I did believe he loved me too. Estavajo says, so when he cheated on you, it hurt. Cassie says, not every time. Estavajo says, bring up this defense exhibit. Then the U.S. prosecutor says, objection, not in evidence. The judge says, that's true. This is not in evidence. Estavajo says, Ms. Ventura, read it just to yourself. Why did you send this message? Cassie says, to let him know I was going to dinner. Estavajo says, what was going on when these messages were sent? Cassie says, I'm not sure. Estavajo says, what was going on in your relationship then? Cassie says, it was early. We were loving. Estavajo says, I offer it. Then the U.S. prosecutor says, objection, being offered for the truth. The judge says, overruled. Estavajo says, please read. Cassie says, I wrote, I love you. Smiley face. I'll fly anywhere for you. I love you, Cass. Estavajo says, this 2009 email. Prosecutor says, objection, hearsay. The judge says, Miss Estavajo, ask more questions. Estavajo says, from BlackBerry, what is BG? Cassie says, baby girl. Estavajo says, what did you write? Cassie says, you hungry? Pop, pop. Estavajo says, and Mr. Combs wrote to you. Quote, we are so in love, we don't do anything else. End quote. How long have you been seeing each other? Cassie says, like 2.5 years. Estavajo says, please read this. 1364. Cassie says, quote, I haven't talked to you at all. You don't even try. You rush me off the phone. I'm really hurt. I don't need your money. I need some attention. End quote. Estavajo says, you wanted your special time with Mr. Combs. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you testify that you told him, I love you so much. You make me a better woman. Cassie says, I definitely wrote those messages. Estavajo says, you wrote, I can't wait until we have a baby of our own. You knew that he had 6 children at the time. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, so now, these messages about freak off, when you say, you know it doesn't matter to me, you mean weekend or weekday? Either is fine? Cassie says, that's what it says. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs says, maybe we can call Jules. Can you do it? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, this was an explicit message from you about the anticipated upcoming freak-off. Then the prosecutor, Johnson, says, objection. The judge says, we will take a recess. They took a break, and then at 10:48 a.m., they are back. The judge says, Miss Estavajo, you may proceed. Estavajo says, Miss Ventura, this is from Mr. Combs to you. You respond with an extremely explicit message, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, this is 2 days after the planning of a freak-off, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, he said, I want to see. How did you reply? Cassie says, I can't wait either. Estavajo says, you wrote, quote, I feel like I want to F, right? Cassie says, that's what it says. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs says, I am so horny. I can't concentrate. What did you say? Cassie says that I'll go to Dwayne Reed for candles and then set up the room. Estavajo says, did you understand that he was going to take another video of you? Then Johnson says, objection, speculation. The judge says, Miss Estavajo, you can move on. Estavajo says, you ask, any pills on you? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what pills were you taking then? Cassie says, opiates. Estavajo says, you deleted videos on your devices, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what did you write? Cassie says that I need to feel this is my husband, the only one who will see this side of me. Estavajo says, were you afraid that Mr. Combs was only seeing you for sex in this way? Cassie says that was a concern. Estavajo says you still were not public in your relationship with him. Cassie says, correct. Estavajo says, were freak-offs important? Cassie says they were integral to us. Estavajo says, who was at your 21st birthday party in Las Vegas? Cassie says, Britney Spears, Dallas Austin. Estavajo says, how did you get them there? Cassie says, they came for Sean. Estavajo says, you are very beautiful and charming. Cassie says, thank you. Estavajo says, it's true. Estavajo says, who is Tommy Mottola? Cassie says, a well-known producer. Estavajo says, you were an up-and-coming star. Cassie says, I guess you could say that. Estavajo says, after you signed with Bad Boy, things were still platonic. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you had rough performance. Cassie says, 106 in Park, it did not go well for me. Estavajo says, how did he help you after that? Cassie says, we did a YouTube video. He said, everybody makes mistakes. Estavajo says, what was wrong? Cassie says, I couldn't hear myself. Estavajo says, you were dating Mr. Leslie. How much older than you was he? Cassie says, 10 years. Estavajo says, then you traveled to Miami with Mr. Combs. The flyer of the event was just a cover to spend time with Mr. Combs, right? Cassie says, that's true. Estavajo says, you had a tattoo of Mr. Leslie's initials on your body, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, how many tattoos did you have then? Prosecutor says, objection, relevance. The judge says, overrule, but let's keep it moving. Cassie says, 3 tattoos. Estavajo says, the one on your arm? Cassie says, yes, it says no regrets. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs thought you had to do oral sex? Cassie says he did. Estavajo says, look at this. Tell me when you are ready. Can you read it? Cassie says, you can read it. It's making me laugh. It's from 2007. Estavajo says, you wrote, I feel protected. You are sweet. Estavajo says, you wrote, I see that Carrie is better fitting for you. I'm hurt that you think I'm malicious. You are very important to me. X, Cass. Cassie laughs. Estavajo says, what were you trying to convey? Cassie says, it's like a journal entry. Estavajo says, you discussed Carrie Morgan. Did you think Mr. Combs was attracted to her? Cassie says, there was a point in the very beginning. Estavajo says, did that complication carry on in your relationship? Cassie says, not really. Carrie was just always with us. Estavajo says, I would like to start asking about freak-offs. Sometimes you wore a wig and a mask. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, the general public did not know. Prosecutor says, objection. The judge says, rephrase. Estavajo says, no one knew until November 2023 in the public. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, fair to say his career was ruined after your lawsuit. Cassie says, I could understand that. Estavajo says, let's read these messages. Mr. Combs wrote, when are you on your period? Cassie says, not now. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs wrote, what you be thinking about when you're horny? Miss Estavajo says, Miss Ventura, if you don't want to read the answers, I can read them. Cassie says, thank you. Estavajo says, the O has lots of O's after them, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, after a freak-off, you would make love with Mr. Combs. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, your period, Mr. Combs is asking you when you're on it, right? Cassie says, yep. Estavajo says he's asking in the context of when to meet up and have sex. Cassie says, looks like it. Estavajo says, sometimes you watch him with a female. Cassie says, 2 or 3 times. Estavajo says, did you talk with Mr. Combs about the swingers lifestyle? Cassie says, that no one talks about it. Estavajo says, were you keeping freak-off secrets from your friends? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, his assistant's helping him? Cassie says, with everything. Estavajo says, you would remember if an assistant came in doing one of your sessions with an escort. Cassie says, not necessarily. I was high. Estavajo says, so you don't remember much? Cassie says, I had my privacy invaded a lot during that relationship. Estavajo says, this is from July 2012. You say to Mr. Combs, I'm horny and bored. This was after a freak-off, right? Cassie says, there are a lot of texts here. It's said to be 25 pages. Prosecutor Johnson says, I would ask that the witness be allowed to read the entire document. The judge says, how many pages? Estavajo says, 8. The prosecutor says, we don't have a copy for the witness. Estavajo says, we'll show it on the screen, but not in the public gallery. Estavajo says, you said Mr. Combs often put you down, but he also sent you encouragement and called you a queen, right? Cassie says, yes. Sidebar. Estavajo says, what would trigger Mr. Combs' incessant calls to you? Cassie says, anger, doubt about where I was. Estavajo says, if he suspected you of cheating, he would call you incessantly. Cassie says, that was one of the reasons. Estavajo says, because he thought. Prosecutor Johnson says, objection. The judge says, that's sustained. Estavajo says, do you believe Mr. Combs has good taste? Cassie says, I think he does. Estavajo says, he's had an impact on fashion. Cassie says, people like his style. Sean John. Estavajo says, did you consult with him on your look? Cassie says, sometimes I got advice I didn't ask for. Estavajo says, he still ran his companies even while having all these freak-offs, right? Cassie says he did. Estavajo says, what was he addicted to? Cassie says, success. She laughs. Estavajo says, what substances? Opiates? Cassie says, yes. He told me and I saw it. Estavajo says, did Mr. Combs' mood depend on whether or not that he was withdrawing from opiates? Cassie says he was more irritable, I would say. Estavajo says, what other drugs was Mr. Combs addicted to? Prosecutor says, objection, no foundation. The judge says, I'll ask if I want the grounds. The judge says, sustain, rephrase. Estavajo says, what was his drug of choice? Cassie says, ecstasy or MDMA. Estavajo says, opiates daily. Cassie says, when he was doing them. Estavajo says, you saw him withdraw? Cassie says, yes. The judge says, we'll break. The jury leaves, witness leaves. The judge says, Miss Estavajo, where are we in your cross-examination? Estavajo says, we have a lot of exhibits. Let me conference over lunch. The judge says, non-responsive. Will you finish today or early tomorrow? Agnifilo says, to the end of tomorrow. Agnifilo says, we might not be able to finish tomorrow. This is the most important witnesses. The judge says, for months, we said this witness had to be off the stand by the end of the week. The U.S. prosecutor says, direct was a day and a half. Limit them to that. The judge says, show Ms. Ventura the exhibits in advance. Maybe just ask her question rather than these exhibits. We have a timing concern. Agnifilo says, they called 2 witnesses to start. That wasn't our choice. It's a critically important witness. The judge says, streamline things. We'll break. They took a break. Then at 1:10 p.m. Eastern, they are back. The judge says, Ms. Estavajo, has the witness had a chance to review the exhibits? The prosecutor says, they are lengthy. The judge says, we'll do the best that we can. I was told this witness would be off the stand by the end of the week. We let the jury go early yesterday. The judge says, if there's something that really needs to be done on cross-examination after lunch tomorrow, I may allow it. We have to leave time for redirect. This witness is being responsive. Cassie enters. The jury enters. As Navajo says, let's turn to GX 411. Prosecutor Johnson says, it's not in evidence yet. As Navajo says, so B414, page 3 and 4, you wrote, I love our freak-offs when we both wanted. You felt that? Cassie says, loving freak-offs were just words at that point. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs wrote to you, I want to freak off right now. And you wrote that you wanted it too. LOL, me too. Cassie says, I texted more than that. As Navajo says, but you did text that to him. Mr. Combs wrote to you, Jules is available if you are into it. As Navajo says, you could have said yes or no. And you said, love you. Cassie says, there was no yes or no. As Navajo says, bring up B-420 on page 2. Mr. Combs wrote, do I have your permission to set up freaky fun? You wrote, ovulation. Cassie says, yes. As Navajo says, here, what do you say? Cassie says, I asked which hotel. I must have called him in between. I don't want to assume anything. As Navajo says, he said montage. You said you could also go to Pleasure Chest. What would you get there? Cassie says, sexual supplies. As Navajo says, what supplies? Cassie says, lubricants, outfits. As Navajo says, he says, have fun, impress me. You say, okay. He says, can we kiss a lot? What do you say? Cassie says, yes. As Navajo says, you wrote, I left the iPad. Cassie says, I don't know whose iPad this meant. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs wrote, I'll be there right after my session. This was in June 2017. Do you remember arguments you were having at that time? Cassie says, not specifically. As Navajo says, here you say the game starts at 10 p.m. No, bringing character to 8 a.m. Cassie says, this was a game a friend of mine told me, a way to rekindle your romance. As Navajo says, by doing something different in the bedroom. Cassie says, it's a whole getting into character thing. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs says, let's get some outfits and go to sex club. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs wrote, surprise package coming from out of state. Why can't I reach you? What did you say? Cassie says, I was getting my eyebrows done. As Navajo says, did you come to know Mr. Combs was leaving the freak-offs to go see Kim Porter? Cassie says, yes. As Navajo says, how did you find out about Gina? How did you feel? Did it upset you? Cassie says, yes. As Navajo says, it prompted arguments? Cassie says, it did. As Navajo says, and he thought you were not faithful. What were his reactions? Cassie says, it was scary. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs wrote to you, let's do something different in NYC this weekend. FYI, Dave hit me. What does hit mean? Cassie says, reached out. As Navajo says, and Daniel contacted me. Did this mean you might have a freak-off? Cassie says, might. As Navajo says, he tells you, You better put me on VIP, vibrate alarm, or something. He is frustrated you don't answer his text fast enough. Cassie says, right. Estavajo says, you tell him to come to NYC, understanding there could be a freak-off. Cassie says, maybe. Estavajo says, you also saw the Book of Mormon. Cassie laughs and says, yes. Estavajo says, mask pleasure? Is that a sex club? Cassie says, I would assume. Estavajo says, he asked you, are you ready for tonight? What do you say? Cassie says, yes, I just have to get some things. Cassie says, this is not about what I felt, right? Because you are skipping over a lot here. Estavajo says, what did you write? Cassie says, as much as you think you are Bruce Willis, you are not. Your kids were babies when we started dating. Estavajo says, if you saw him on social media on vacation it was heartbreaking. Cassie says, it could be. I was 7 years in. Estavajo says, and what about this? About Gina. You wrote, I don't want to be a side piece, but I'll treat you as a king. Estavajo says, you wanted to be the main girlfriend. Cassie says, in 2013, yes. Estavajo says, you saw social media posts of Mr. Combs with other girlfriends and got angry, right? Cassie says, can I speak? I was jealous of certain situations. Estavajo says, did there come a time he suspected you were in a relationship with someone in the industry? Mr. Mescuti? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs thought it would be good for your career if you collaborated with Mr. Mr. Mescuti. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, why did you begin your relationship with Mr. Mescuti? Cassie says, we enjoy each other's company. Estavajo says, you were in a relationship with Mr. Combs. Cassie says, we were on a break. Estavajo says, but you were still doing freak-offs with him. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, after Mr. Combs found out by going through your phone, you went to see him. You knew he was upset. He previously attacked you. Cassie says, yes. I thought I would be safer with other people there. They took a break. And then at 2:38 p.m., the judge says, okay, let's get Ms. Ventura back and the jury. The jury enters. Estavajo says, your affair with Mr. Mescuti was only a month long, but you got a burner phone for it. Cassie says, right. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs kicked you in the back. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, this came up later in your relationship that you had cheated on him with Kid Cudi. Cassie says, he brought it up quite a bit. Estavajo says, when he cheated, he said, well, you had an affair with Kid Cudi, right? Cassie says, sometimes. Estavajo says, he suspected you of having an affair with another person in the industry. You were in South Africa filming. Cassie says, yes, Honey 3. She laughs. Estavajo says, while you were there, you saw a photo of Mr. Combs with Gina and were irritated, right? Cassie says, angry. Estavajo says, you blocked them and focused on the movie, right? Cassie says, I tried my best. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs suspected you of relationship with whom? Cassie says, Michael B. Jordan. Estavajo says, you sent a video not only to Mr. Combs, but also to staff. Who? D-Rock? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you sent it to them because you were angry with all of them. Cassie says, I was hurt. I spent all my time with them. Estavajo says, you thought they were in on it? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, the physical abuse. When did your father learn about it? Cassie says, same time as my mother. Estavajo says, did Mr. Combs come to Connecticut to speak to your parents? Cassie says, I don't know if it was then. Estavajo says, Carrie Morgan knew about the abuse. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, the eyebrow gash incident. What was it about? Cassie says, didn't answer the phone and went to sleep. I was supposed to be packing up for a trip. Estavajo says, he was inebriated. Cassie says, I don't remember that. Estavajo says, why were you asleep? Cassie says, a drink at the Abbey had something in it, I think. Estavajo says, did Mr. Combs ever abuse you while he was inebriated? Then say he didn't remember it? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, did you feel he was not taking responsibility? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, for drugs, you would both go to rehab. Cassie says rehab wasn't really a thing during our relationship. Estavajo says, the freak-offs were an opportunity for you to take drugs together. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you went to a lot of Burning Man. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, did you ever call yourselves Get High Partners? Cassie says, we did. Estavajo says, did you take drugs from him without him knowing it? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what was his reaction? Cassie says, explosive. Estavajo says, did he tell LA dealers not to deal to you? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you told Miss Coram that you learned only after the fact that Mr. Combs had dangled Mr. Bongolan off the balcony. Cassie says, I'm not sure. Estavajo says, you were on drugs. Cassie says, I'm not sure. Estavajo says, you got a life coach for your drug use, according to this document? Cassie says, I don't know who that person is. Estavajo says, you were doing a lot of drugs? Cassie says, it was a rough time. Estavajo says, you tried to get into a rehab, the Golden Door. Cassie says, it was a spa. There was a time I lost all sense of smell and taste and woke up in a hospital with an IV in my arm. I tried then to get help. Estavajo says, the time after San Bernardino, you learned that he had overdosed. Cassie says, a very strong opiate, yes. Estavajo says, were you ever not addicted to painkillers? Cassie says, we took Ibogaine. Estavajo says, where did you get it? Cassie says, Cancun, Mexico, separately. Estavajo says, when Mr. Combs threw you off the boat in Canes, when he accused you of taking drugs and squeezed your leg, Cassie says, among other things. Estavajo says, but you still wanted to be with him. Cassie says, I did. Estavajo says, switching topics. When you say Mr. Combs went with guns to find Suge Knight, do you remember telling the government that you did go with them? Cassie says, no. Estavajo says, let me show you. Prosecutor says, just for the parties. Cassie says, I did not go with them, so I don't think I said that. Estavajo says, you also did drugs with Miss Morgan, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, do you recall telling the government that you did not see what he did, hitting her in the head with a wooden hanger? Cassie says, I saw the hanger, I saw he was angry that I was doing drugs with Carrie. Estavajo says, this broke up your 17-year friendship with her. Cassie says it did. Estavajo says, did you tell Mr. Combs about your relationship with your now husband? Cassie says no. Estavajo says, Miss Morgan sued you and Mr. Combs. Cassie says, made a demand. Estavajo says, and you paid part of that. Cassie says, I did. Estavajo says, and you haven't spoken with her since? Cassie says, maybe one text. Estavajo says, that was the relationship ender? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you would heat up the baby oil. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, now, is this from the day before the Intercontinental Hotel incident? Prosecutor says, this is a long document. We need time to read it. The judge says, we'll take a break then. They took a break, and then at 4:08 p.m. Eastern, they are back. The judge says, we are in the home stretch of the day. Let's get a jury back. All rise. Jury entering. Estavajo says, is this from March 4th? Prosecutor says, with UCT time, it is March 3rd. Estavajo says, okay, Mr. Combs refers to accessories. Cassie says, for the premiere. Estavajo says, you sent him an explicit message. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, he responded with number of M's. He wrote, too bad you have to work, LOL. Cassie says he did. Estavajo says, you ask him, are you feeling better? Then he's discussing bodily function. Cassie says yes. Cassie says, could we just clarify what time these messages are really from with the UCT? Prosecutor says, there's a stipulation on that. See below. Okay, here it is. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs went to your premiere lunch at London Hotel. Cassie says he did. Estavajo says, then he says, I just got out of a spiritual therapy session. Cassie says, I asked, how did it go? Estavajo says, he said it's a process. This is leading up to the hotel incident. Estavajo says, you say, baby, I want to freak off so bad. You were asked in your direct and said you didn't want him to ruin your premiere. Cassie says, sure. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs says, if we start at 7 p.m. and go until 4 a.m., you can get enough rest after. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, he's saying it would be a shorter than usual freak-off. Cassie says, that's how I would understand it. Estavajo says, what do you say? Cassie says, Carrie is here. We can't do it at my house. Estavajo says, you say that guy is sick. I'm not going to ask you what you meant. Estavajo says, so you were turning to Johnny. Was he a dancer or an escort? Cassie says, we hired him as a dancer, but he did what an escort does. Estavajo says, do you remember the beginning of this freak-off in the Intercontinental? Cassie says, not really. Estavajo says, the drugs were bad, MDMA, right? Cassie says, I have no idea. The judge says, it's 5 o'clock. Jurors, you may go home. Do not look up anything about the case. All rise. The judge says, thank you, Ms. Ventura. No discussions with the government. We'll see you tomorrow. Everyone else may be seated. Witness leaves. The judge says, how much more? Estavajo says, let me check. Prosecutor Johnson says, half an hour on redirect. Agnifilo says, we'll figure it out tomorrow. The judge says, have your next witness ready tomorrow. Who are they? Prosecutor says, Dawn Richard. The judge says if there are more issues, someone needs to email the court. Again, issues off docket. And that was it, you guys. So that is all for day 3 of Cassie's testimony. All right, let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any new updates. And I will see you on the next one. Peace.